Right, I think we're half past, I'm told, so welcome to this meeting of the Economic Planning and Housing Committee. I have a chart in front of me that says, I need to give you some housekeeping, that's fire evacuation procedures for this evening's meetings. There are no fire alarms scheduled for this evening, therefore, if the fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exits are located at the rear and the side of this room. Go down the stairs and meet in the War Memorial Park. Webcasted meetings, well, please note that this meeting is being webcast live on the internet. Correct, yeah. And mobile phones, please can all members and public switch their phones off or turn them to silent. We've got quite an interesting agenda tonight. Before we crack on, all of you know me thankfully, but it's my first meeting as chairman of the committee. So I'm delighted to be here and be your chairman this year. I think the Economic Planning and Housing Committee has an important role in the formation and information and challenging and informing of policy, and I look forward to working with all members to that end this year. Apologies for absence and substitutions. We have none looking round. So, appointment of a vice chairman. Do we have any nominations? We do not. We'll move on. Declarations of interest. No declarations. We have no urgent matters. So the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of January. Councillor Harvey.
Thanks, Chair. Just in reference to the resolved items on page 7. On the first one at the top of the agenda, resolved in regard to Hampshire County Council and the Buckskin Flood Alleviating Scheme. Could we ask whether or not it's possible to get an update and be kept informed of the ongoing work on that? That was a resolved item, so it would be just an update would be welcome, I think, on fulfilling that resolution. And then on the second resolved item at the bottom of the page, again, in terms of the work associated with what we resolved there, could we add that to the work programme and have that come back in an appropriate way for us to consider?
I think if that's what we agreed and resolved, that seems completely appropriate. No other comments? Okay. Agree those. Item 6 is the master planning of local plan allocated housing sites. Councillor Raphael.
Chairman, I want to just bring this item before you. We thought, when I discussed this with officers, that it would be useful just to say what we're doing before you then get the master planning documents to consider. So I'm going to ask Jill Fisher to explain the overall picture to you. And I think next week we will start looking at the first development brief. You will remember, indeed, I was looking round the committee. It seems to be those on this side, bar one, possibly bar Gary Watts as well, although he was a latecomer to EPH as we were doing the local plan. He was back in it on the last year of it, I think, but when we were still dealing with policies, he might not have been back on the council. I can't remember. But we were insistent that we have these master planning briefs, and this is, as it were, all of us keeping our word that we want to have our input for these larger sites. And I think those on the other side, most of them weren't here, even though they may have been here on previous lives or sitting on the sidelines. So Jill is going to introduce this item.
Thank you. Well, as Councillor Raphael says, in Policy SS3 of the adopted local plan, there is a requirement for the Greenfield strategic allocations to have a master plan or development brief which will guide that development. So this report is simply sort of setting out the situation in terms of those 12 strategic allocations. And as you'll see from the papers, 5 of those have planning permission already, leaving 7 to which the policy still applies. And the report takes us through what our intention is as officers in terms of taking forward master planning or development briefs. And we've related this to the scale of the site, the current status. And it's probably worth pointing out that when this policy was drafted, there was considerably less information about the actual allocation than we currently now have, because as you may recall, the inspector asked for inset plans, which were provided through the examination process. We also published site constraint maps and statements of common ground, which actually fleshed out the original policy quite considerably. So there was already quite a bit more information than was originally envisaged when the local plan was submitted. It's important also to point out that the role of the development brief, which is at a high level in terms of strategic requirements, it's in order to make sure that the development is coordinated and produces a high quality development, but at the same time is not intended to delay the delivery of the much needed housing for the borough or constrain developers unduly. So it's setting out that balance between providing enough guidance to ensure a good development, but at the same time not being too prescriptive. So very briefly, going through the sites that are left, Swing Swang Lane is considered as a very small site. It's very self-contained, and we don't think there is sufficient benefit in the production of a development brief for that site. That can very adequately come forward through a planning application. Redlands, east of Basingstoke, is one of the sites we do feel that needs a development brief, and that's one we're working on, and I'll come on to that. Upper Cufford Farm, likewise, but because it's due to be developed later on in the plan period, that's something that will come forward in the next couple of years. Down is one we're working on, and as Councillor Rafel says, that will be considered by EPH on the 20th of July. Basingstoke Golf Course, likewise, is one that's planned for development later in the plan period, and therefore we will do a development brief in due course. And Hanson Fields, as members will be aware, is already an outline planning application, and therefore it's not really suitable for preparation of a development brief, but the same scrutiny of that planning application will take place. So in terms of the two that we're currently taking forward, Redlands and east of Basingstoke, two key sites to the east, we had quite a lot of work with the landowners, Hampshire County Council already, but when we started doing some work to prepare a development brief, and we looked again and also had a very useful meeting with local members, it was felt that there was more technical information needed in order to provide a meaningful development brief. And so the paper set out the proposed timescale for that. I think it's fair to say the County Council have concern about that timescale, and it is possible that it might not make September EPH, but that was what we're working on at the current time, but it may be that that might have to slip. So that's east of Basingstoke Redlands. And Down development brief, I probably don't need to say very much more about that because that will be considered at EPH next week. So that's our proposal in terms of how we're going to address the issue of preparing development briefs for the strategic sites. Thank you.
So in case you wonder why this is here, it's more a question of just informing members that we are doing what we said we would do, and obviously you'll get down to the nuts and bolts of it next week. But as you can see, there's been quite a bit of preparatory work in relation to one of the sites with ward members already, and the process of engagement, it's a bit chicken and egg. Where do we say what we want and allow the developers then to develop accordingly, or do we let them get on with it and see what they're coming up with and adjust? So it's very much a question of doing two things at once, and that's where we are. So if you want, I'm sure if you want to ask questions through the chairman of the broad principles of where we are, or it might be just so obvious you don't need to.
Any questions? Councillor Harvey.
Thanks, Chair. Just on page 13 on the Redlands and the east of Basingstoke, will the master plan include the 450 units that are seen beyond the plan period? It just seems logical if there's going to be a master plan, then surely the master plan should be of the site's potential in the fullest context and not, as it were, something that is left to question. And then the second question I had really relating to, if it's going to be delayed in any way, shape or form, how does that then impact on the 5-year housing land supply in any way, shape or form? Is that a concern that we need to be aware of, considering it's the best part of 1,000 units we're talking there, potentially being delayed in the way you describe? Just want to try to understand that.
The issue of the wider sites is something that we're aware of and County are aware of. And as we're looking at the brief, that is something that needs to be taken into account. So how that will actually look in terms of development brief is undecided at the moment. But in terms of the technical studies that are going on, they're very aware of that. That's part of the brief for those buckets of work. And when you're looking even at the capacity for the 450, obviously you need to be aware of the rest of the site, how that capacity affects the rest of the site in terms of land uses, etc. So that's all part of what will be looked at through that process. So yes, it is on the table. In terms of delays, if there is a delay, it will only be a small delay. It would be probably a matter of months. So if it didn't come in September, it would probably come in November to the next DPH after that. So in terms of land supply, there would be a minimal impact.
So just in terms of where the county's thinking on this, would it be the county's decision effectively as landowner promoting the site as to whether they want the 450 included in it, or would we be advising them that it would be appropriate for them to see the 450 as part of it? Infrastructure, all those implications that you're alluding to, obviously. And then secondly, if there is a delay, and say it's a couple of months, I mean, does that affect where county are talking about bringing it forward as a planning application? Does that change their perspective? Have there been conversations around that? So it's obviously having a master plan is one thing, but bringing it forward as a planning application, either outline or for whatever, is a different matter entirely.
And we have spoken to county about that, and as Jill referred to earlier, I mean, they have got concerns about whether these can be done in time, in terms of timescales. Their view is that they wouldn't submit an application until the development brief was in place. So if you were looking at adoption, if there was 2 months delay around March of next year, then they would submit after that. But they are doing all the technical work alongside the development brief to inform the development brief and also an application. So that work needs to be done in any case. So if they weren't ready to do a planning application, even if we push forward with the development brief, it wouldn't really have an impact overall.
Just finally then, my only concern then, say you get to March, say it gets delayed, the last thing we want really is to have a consultation on a planning application over the summer period, for example, say August or July, talking about dates of preparing a planning application, the involvement of technical reports and God knows what to put the planning application through. You wouldn't want that over the summer. So you could be talking about the autumn to fairly and legitimately bring a planning application forward so the community was consulted properly. I mean, it's always advisable not to put planning applications through in August, isn't it? Not in the summer months. So as long as county are aware of that and the implications of that, and the residents and the ward members and everybody's treated fairly in a consultation, that's fine. It's just having assurance that that's the case.
They are aware of that, and they're quite keen to do as much consultation up front as part of the development brief as possible to involve stakeholders and things up front.
Any other questions, members? On that basis, I think we're here to note it, so can we consider that noted? Yeah. Very good, thank you. Next item is the Community and Infrastructure Levy. We'll let the officers do a little swap, get into position. We have Dominic Houston from Three Dragons joining us for this one. Councillor Raphael.
Chairman, thank you. Together with you, Chairman, we obviously thought it was necessary for there to be a briefing of members beforehand, because a number of us have been up the SIL path before over the last few years, and then have not necessarily had the opportunity to put the SIL into action. We've now arrived at long last on the threshold of bringing SIL in, and we fully appreciate that this may not be everyone's perfect solution for delivering infrastructure, but unfortunately or fortunately, it is the solution that we have got, and we have to do the best with what we've got and to make it work. Once again, we have gone to Three Dragons for their assessment of the viability of each of the sites and the appropriate charge to make. And I hope that you'll be able to ask Dominic pertinent questions about his analysis so that you can have confidence in the rates that are being set. The progress from here will be to Cabinet on Monday if it meets with your approval, and from Cabinet to full Council if Cabinet's approval is gained, and if full Council approve it on Thursday next week, then it will go out for consultation I think in September to see the response to that, and then I think it goes to inspector thereafter. Hopefully that's about right. So I will hand over to Dominic, and he will give his presentation. How long's your presentation?
About a quarter now.
Well, Should we see if we do what we did before with when we had Alison earlier, that we'll allow Dominic to just give his presentation, and then the chairman will take you through slide by slide, and you can ask questions as you go through it again, so that, as it were, in case he covers ground later, and it allows you perhaps to absorb it better without interruption and deviation, if that is what the chairman agrees.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, all of you. Just to repeat, my name's Dominic Houston from Three Dragons. We've been preparing viability evidence in support of the field charging schedule, and I prepared some slides which I've tried to balance giving you a full picture of the work we've done and what it means in terms of the SIL rate without getting unnecessarily technical. But I know you also have access to the full report, and I'm happy to answer questions on that if you've had a chance to read it, or at a later date through Mark and Alison and Jill subsequently. So the purpose really of the presentation is to just explain how this fits. We've been undertaking viability work for Basingstoke and Dean since 2013. The work's been used to generate the initial preliminary draft charging schedule, and was then used through various updates to support the council through the local plan examination last year. What I wanted to do was to briefly take you through the context for SIL, take you through our approach to viability testing, talk you through the findings and what that means in terms of the SIL rate, and then answer the questions. In terms of the principles of SIL, I'll go through this fairly briefly because I think most of you know roughly what it is. Essentially, it is a levy on development. It's levied as pounds per square metre. It's for developments of one dwelling or more, or for non-residential development, 100 square metres. In order for the council to justify setting a rate, it has to prove that there's a need for infrastructure and there's a deficit in funding, either there is a funding gap. Now that's done through your infrastructure delivery plan, which is part of the local plan evidence base, which is also reflected in a regulation 123 list, which is what the SIL money is to be spent on. The other justification for a SIL rate is that development is able to pay it without being jeopardised. So this covers the majority of development. The process does acknowledge that some marginal development may no longer be viable under a SIL regime, but still the majority of development will still be able to come forward, and thus the development plan, the local plan, will still be deliverable. There can be different rates for different areas, can be different rates for different uses. There are a set of exemptions and reliefs as well. So, for example, social housing, affordable housing, doesn't pay SIL. Buildings built by charities don't pay SIL, and custom and self-build doesn't pay SIL as well. The regulation 123 list, as I said, sets out what the money will be spent on. The obligation to pay SIL is identified at consent, and then the obligation then comes into force when the scheme is commenced. As per the briefing earlier on, it's likely that there will be an instalment policy which will delay the obligation to pay. Also, development can come forward in phases, so the obligation to pay the SIL for each phase is timed when that phase comes in. So there can be a combined phasing and instalment policy as well, if the council chooses to do that. Although SIL, in many respects, replaces 106, there will still be a Section 106 in order to mitigate direct site impacts. And we've allowed for that within our testing, but it is important that you're aware that there will still be some minor Section 106 obligations as appropriate to mitigate direct site impacts. So this won't be Section 106 that will be able to fund wider infrastructure development serving a wider area, as it has done in the past, but it will have to fit within the three tests and be directly related to the development concerned. Really, the three big issues for the charging authority, for you, really, is what to charge in due course, what will be the mechanisms for collection, and then what will be the governance arrangements for spending. my presentation today really only covers the first of those three. There's maybe two other things really that I should say which aren't on that slide. The principle of SIL is that you can collect in one location and spend in another, and that's quite radically different from Section 106, where the spending has to be linked to the development that's providing it. For SIL, that's not the case. So that gives the council much more flexibility in terms of deciding where to spend the SIL money and on what piece of infrastructure. So that's one thing. And then the other principle of SIL, and this also applies to any planning obligation, is that the cost of it is met by the landowner. The bill costs don't change. The return that the developer needs to meet his or her risk, they don't change. The finance costs don't change. It's actually the imposition of affordable housing, any other Section 106, or SIL, will come off the land value. And that's how it all works. But that becomes important, and you'll see that later on when I explain how we attempt to work it out. The other part of the context is that now Basingstoke-on-Deane has an adopted local plan. An up-to-date development plan is a prerequisite for SIL. You can't have a SIL charging schedule without a local plan, and you have that now. There's about 100 local authorities with an adopted SIL. It's worthwhile saying that part of the context is that Liz Peace from the HBF has been charged by the government to undertake a review of SIL to see if it's fit for purpose. That review was due to report in May and June this year and has got caught up in PERDA, and there is no word yet as to exactly when that will come forward. However, that may change the basis for the way that Basingstoke-on-Deane and everywhere else implements its SIL, but we'll have to wait and see what's due to happen. There have been various rumours trailed. We've asked DCLG. We did some of the research which informed that review, but they're not saying anything. So all I'm doing is sort of raising it as a risk, as an unknown, but it's not something I can do anything about at this stage. There have been various changes that have been affecting the viability of development. The budget statement from July last year, 1% cut in housing association rents, that has an impact on the value of affordable housing to a developer. House values have increased, but there's also been an increase in build costs as well. Interest rates have gone down, finance costs have become less onerous. I suppose you could add to that list sort of current uncertainties in the housing market, which I can't tell are a short-term bubble and may be mitigated by effective government when that returns, or whether it will be a long-term problem. But I suppose that's another risk that we can't quantify at the moment. The Self-Build and Custom House Building Act has come in. The Housing and Planning Act has come in, along with right to buy for housing association tenants, the duty to promote the development of starter homes, and then the starter homes technical consultation, which has just recently finished. There's been no response come back from that from DCLG, but that was talking about a potential requirement for 20% of dwellings to be starter homes. And again, so that there's a set of sort of risks and changing environments. It is true, of course, that there will always be changes, and it doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't at all mean that one shouldn't attempt to make progress. But it's only right to bring those things because they're part of the context within which we're doing our work, and then you have to consider what it means for Basingstoke-on-Deane. So viability testing. The viability of development is central to setting a SIL rate. And what we use is a standard industry approach. So what we're doing is nothing new. It's been found sound at examinations. It's what we've used for examinations, and it's what other viability consultants have also used for examinations as well. This slide here has got sort of two illustrations about what viability is, really. Essentially, what we're doing is, and this is the blue box on the right, if one considers what the total value of a scheme is, what the total value of a development is, that's the value of the market houses, the sales value, and it's the value of the affordable housing that the developer will get from the registered providers when they purchase it. And then from that, quite simply, is subtracted the cost of development, and that will, of course, include the build cost, the finance costs, it will include the developer return, and we will also then take off the cost of meeting the policy requirements. So that will be affordable housing, which tends to be the largest single policy cost, as well as any other Section 106 obligations as well. And that leaves an amount which is available to pay for land. Now, it's worthwhile saying at this stage that we're comparing two very big numbers. There's a very big number which is the value of the development, and a very big number which is the cost of bringing the development forward, and there's not that much between them proportionately. So small changes in house prices and small changes in build costs can change viability quite quickly. So anyway, we've got this gap where there is money available to pay for land, and what we do is we compare that to a nominal benchmark land value and essentially say, is that enough money that the landowner will release the land for development, or will he or she keep it in current use, whatever that might be, agricultural or industrial land. So that's what the viability testing is. It's simple. There's lots of technical bits within it, but the overall principle is very simple. The benchmark land value, which, as we've seen from the previous slides, is an important component of viability testing, is an estimate of the lowest value at which a landowner will sell. Land can and will, and probably should, change hands at higher values, but it's an estimate of the lowest value below which the land won't come forward to development. It needs to be above existing use values, and it needs to have a premium over existing use values, otherwise there's no incentive for a landowner to release it. There's a huge amount of argument available to say, well, what kind of premium is fair for a landowner to release land? The government guidance says, and the NPPF says, it's got to be a competitive return to a landowner, but that's not defined in any numeric way. It's important to note that, well, as I said before, planning obligations come out of land values, but also DCRG has clarified that land values must take into account planning policies. And this was confirmed most recently in relation to a site called the Territorial Army site in Islington, where there was an appeal about the amount of affordable housing on that site, and the appeal went against the council, and on the grounds that the developer had paid X for the site, and that didn't allow them, therefore, to meet the affordable housing obligations. Now, subsequently, CLG confirmed in a letter to Islington that, in fact, land values should take account of planning obligations as well, which is, again, important when deciding what benchmark land values would be. So taking account of premiums over existing use and also a reflection of what market evidence is available on land values, the table on the right-hand side of this slide sets out the benchmarks that we use. Now, these are expressed as pounds per gross hectare. Most of these benchmarks were part of the viability evidence that went through the local plan examination, and in some senses that's quite useful, really, because what you're looking at is evidence that's already been publicly examined. Now, since that local planning evidence was developed, it would be fair to say that the viability of development in Basingstoke has become stronger. Build costs have gone up, but values have gone up more, and so arguably landowners may have slightly higher expectations for their land. And so what we've done some sensitivity testing to see, well, what would be the impact if slightly higher benchmarks were used. So this is part of the consideration that we've used when looking at things from as many angles as possible in order to recommend a sill rate. Sorry, wrong button. Sorry. Oh yeah, beg your pardon. Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, there we are. Thanks very much. As you'll have seen from the diagram about the process of doing the viability study, one of the key ingredients is what the development's worth. This slide here sort of talks about the house prices we've used for the market values. As before, we've used two market value areas in Basingstoke and Deane. So at a much earlier stage of this viability process, we reviewed the pattern of different house prices across the borough, and it was fairly clear that there are Basingstoke and Deane and Tadley share roughly common values. I mean, there will be local differences within all of this, but broadly speaking, they share roughly common values, with then higher values in the rest of the borough in terms of the rural areas and the market towns. And so we have generated a set of house prices to use in the testing on the back of that. And the information source we use for that is the land registry, where you can get price paid data, actual prices for all transactions. And you can see those prices then set out in the table below. And that's done for detached houses of different sizes, semi-detached, terraced and flats. It would be fair to say that it is less likely that some of these dwelling types will be seen in all parts of the borough. So, for example, I would be surprised to see major flatted developments outside Basingstoke, and I would be surprised to see predominantly detached houses within the urban area of Basingstoke. But nonetheless, for the testing, we've created a wide set of house price values, and these have been checked through a development industry workshop, which took place in July last year in this room. Oh yeah, that's where I'm going wrong, isn't it? Sorry, I ought to know that by now. The sorry, excuse me. Yeah, good, thank you. As I said, the testing we do is of policy compliant development. So within all of the testing, we build into it the costs of providing the affordable housing, so 40% affordable housing, using a 70% rented and 30% shared ownership split, 15% of dwellings built to Part M42 accessibility standards, which broadly speaking is lifetime homes. There is a residual post-SIL Section 106.278 allowance of £1,500 per dwelling, and this is to cover specific on-site provision for open space, local transport improvements and so on. We've built in sustainable water requirements for new dwellings as per the required standards for that. And we've also made allowances for a proportion of self-build on strategic sites. We've also included a buffer as well as required by guidance when we come to set the SIL rates, but we'll come on to that maybe more later on. The costs included in the assessment, there are a set of standard development costs which will apply to development everywhere. So that's build costs. We use the BCIS, which is produced by the RICS. We make an allowance for external work, so that's to do with estate roads, laying of utilities and so on to dwellings, boundaries, soft landscaping and so on. Professional fees, finance, marketing costs, a developer return. The developer return is set in relation to the perceived risk. We use a developer return of 20%, which is standard for market houses. And we use a contractor return for affordable houses, and that's a contractor return of 6%, and that reflects the lower risk in terms of developing affordable houses, because of course they are pre-sold before they're built. We make an allowance for agents and legal costs and stamp duty land tax, and for larger sites we also make an additional allowance for the cost of opening up larger sites. To that we then add the policy costs, affordable housing, accessibility, as talked, water standards, Section 106, open space requirements for larger sites, and then for the strategic sites, we reflect the cost of delivering the specific policy requirements for those strategic sites, and they're set out in the different policies for the golf course, hounds and fields, and so on. The testing structure is split into three. We use some sort of generic 1 hectare tiles, and the reason we use those is to take a standard area and to say, well, what aspects of or characteristics of development should we change, and be able to see what the impacts on viability are. So it enables us to test developments of different density in terms of dwellings per hectare. It also enables us to sensitivity test different affordable housing tenures, to put in some social rent, see what the impact of that is, and also enables us to sensitivity test different benchmark land values. Then we undertake some case study testing, where we use some sort of generic case studies which are representative of the types of small and medium-sized developments that are likely to come forward in the borough, and we use a variety of schemes between 1 and 100 dwellings. It includes some higher density flatted schemes with different parking arrangements and so on, and sheltered accommodation as well. And then we undertake testing of these strategic sites. Now that used 5 strategic sites as set out there, and that testing was informed by some quite detailed work undertaken by council officers in terms of the costs of the infrastructure provision that would be required to be delivered through Section 106, and also the land budgets as well for a policy compliant scheme. So this is in advance of any master planning, and I appreciate you're now talking about that, but these are sort of policy compliant amounts of green space and other non-saleable areas that have to be provided by the development. So quite a lot of detailed work has gone into the strategic sites to understand the cost that those strategic sites would bear. And to say that the larger case studies, we use a discounted cash flow as well, and what this does, it takes into account the impact of time. So for a larger scale development, there will be a set of costs that come in at one time, and then the values start to come in, and then other costs will come in. And what this process does is that it enables the positive and negative cash flow balances to be taken into account, as well as putting in a time discount as well. And we use the Treasury discount rate of 3.5% per annum in order to assess the impact of time. So onto the results. I'm not going to take you through every nuance of the results really, because it would take us some time, although I can explain them further in more detail if you want. What I put up here is a slide showing the residual value. So this is the difference between the value and the build cost for a 1 hectare tile in Basingstoke and Tadley. Up the vertical axis, you can see what the value is. That's in thousands. So that goes from $500,000, million, 1.5 million, 2 million, and so on. Across the bottom, we've got the different bars showing the different densities of development, with 20 dph on the left and 30 dph, 35 and 45 dph. There's 2 different coloured bars because we're modelling for the rental component. We're modelling 100% affordable rent in the blue bars, with 30% intermediate as well as part of the affordable housing mix. But for the red bars, we're also introducing a quarter of the rental component as social rent as well, in order to cover those situations where there is a need for social rent and will need to be delivered. The horizontal lines of different colour represent the main benchmark land value, £1 million per hectare, an upper benchmark land value at 1.3 million, and then a sensitivity land value at 1.5 million. And you can see, for example, within that, the 20 dph schemes are less valuable. The schemes that have got social rent rather than all affordable rent for the rental component of the affordable housing are slightly less valuable as well. And you can see that the main development densities of 30 and 35 dph are quite reasonably viable within that context. So what we've done is we've done similar 1 hectare tiles for the rest of the borough as well, and then we've done the same approach for the case studies and for the strategic sites as well. In terms of the sort of the broad findings from the 1 hectare tile and the smaller case study findings, the rest of borough has got stronger viability than Basingstoke and Tadley, and the reason for that is because the values are higher. The build costs aren't any higher, but the values are. So the amount available to pay for land is considerably more in the rest of borough. As you've seen from the previous slide, the really low density schemes are less viable than mid-range densities. But then once you get to the high density schemes, which are the flatted schemes in urban Basingstoke, then the viability weakens quite considerably. And 2 out of the 3 flatted schemes we tested were quite clearly not viable. The flats we tested at 95 and up to 180 dwellings per hectare. So you can see there's a very different set of densities tested there. And in lots of ways, the lack of viability for flatted schemes in Basingstoke is not unexpected. It's the sort of thing you would expect to see in many towns of Basingstoke size and in this particular situation. Undercroft car parking has a big impact on the viability of flaccid schemes because of the cost required to provide that. We also found that single dwellings have weak viability. BCIS indicates there's some very high development costs for single dwellings. My view is that going forward, given that custom build and self-build are not liable to pay CIL, I would imagine that most single dwelling developments will come forward as custom build or self-build. I would imagine that there would be little incentive to do otherwise financially for most developers, because essentially it just means an agreement to sell before the development is built in effect. Sheltered housing schemes have got greater proportions of communal space and slightly higher build costs as well, and as a result the viability for sheltered accommodation is weaker than for general housing, and the extra costs mean that they are not really able to provide a CIL, although they are just about meeting the benchmark. In terms of the strategic sites, in a way, whilst all of the viability is important, in a way that I think the strategic sites are particularly important because that's where a great proportion of the development planned under the local plan is due to take place. So you can see the graph there has got the residual value per hectare set against a benchmark land value. You may recollect from the table earlier on that we use a lower benchmark land value for strategic sites, and that's because strategic sites, well, their existing use is agricultural, which they start off from a lower value, but also the land is worth less because it costs considerably more to develop a strategic site than it does for a small infill site which already has services connected and so on. So they're tested against a benchmark land value of £400,000 per hectare. You can see the most viable strategic sites are the golf course and Upper Cuford Farm, and the least viable is Hounsome Fields, but you can also see that all of them meet that benchmark land value. The table at the bottom of that slide has got the summary of the infrastructure costs on a per dwelling basis for the different strategic sites that were tested, and that actually reads straight across into the different viability that you can see in the graph above. So for example, Hounsome Fields, which is the least viable site, has got an infrastructure cost of 18,600 per dwelling, which is higher than the golf course, which is more viable, which has an infrastructure cost of 11,620 per dwelling. So just to remind you, those infrastructure costs were developed from the conversations council officers have had with service providers about the amount of infrastructure that's required to be provided on those sites. It's also worthwhile saying those strategic sites also have an allowance of £200,000 per net hectare in terms of opening up costs, as well as the standard external works and £1,500 per dwelling, section 106. Forgive the title of this slide, it's not useful. This slide here sets out then what the proposed CIL rates are on a per square metre basis and then compares them to the earlier preliminary draft charging schedule. So you can see that the proposed CIL rates or recommended CIL rates from us are £30 per square metre for Hounsome Fields, which wasn't allocated in 2015 and would have been at the time captured by the wider rate of £150 per square metre, although that wouldn't have recognised the cost for bringing that site forward. Many Down has got a proposed rate of £60 per square metre. Last time the recommendation was nil. As I said before, the increased values, and whilst build costs have gone up, they haven't gone up as much, has meant that all of the strategic sites are now more viable than they were when they were last tested. The other strategic sites are recommended for £80 per square metre. It's worthwhile saying that all of these strategic sites have got a fairly substantial buffer, and by buffer I mean a reduction compared to the theoretical maximum CIL that they might be able to pay. So the buffers are about 44% for all of those strategic sites, except for the golf course and Qfod Farm, which is about 55%. And that's really just to keep partly to keep the charging schedule simple, but also partly in reflection to the slightly higher existing use value arguments that are coming out of the golf course as well, which are to some extent backed up. Single dwellings, we were proposing a nil rate because of the lack of viability for single dwellings. Wholly flatted schemes, we also recommended a nil rate. And then other general development in Basingstoke and Tadley, £140 per square metre compared to £70 last time. And other development in the rest of Borough, £200 per square metre compared to £150 last time. In terms of how this might compare to sill rates in your neighbouring authorities, I would say a certain amount of caution should be exercised because, of course, they will have different housing values and they will have different affordable housing policies and different Section 106 requirements. Nonetheless, it's still worthwhile looking over the board to see what neighbours are doing. The highest neighbouring rates are in Wokingham. They're between £300 to £365 per square metre, so considerably above these rates. But many of the others have rates between £100 to £180 per square metre, and there are zones in most neighbouring authorities that are under £90 a square metre. So you can see there's a sort of a variety of different rates in neighbouring authorities, and I would say that the rates we're talking about for Basingstoke here are within the range of rates seen within this part of the country, but they're probably slightly above the median, although that implies some kind of mathematical calculation. I mean, my judgment would be they're slightly above average. On a per dwelling basis, a 100 square market 3-bedroom house, a reasonably sizable 3-bedroom house, would pay £14,000 in SIL for when it's within the £140 per square metre rate. So this would be small sites within Basingstoke and Tadley. This is what will be being asked of them, and they will also be asked to pay possibly £1,500 Section 106 for site-specific mitigation. Where the SIL rate applies for the rest of the borough, then that would rise to £20,000 SIL. And then proportionally similar sorts of figures for 4-bedroom houses and so on. So that's what I was proposing to say to you as part of the presentation now. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'd be very happy to take any questions. I beg your pardon.
No, he's Chair. I'm just going to ask, can I point one thing out?
Councillor Raphael.
Can I just point one thing out to the committee? In, I think it was slide number 3, first page. Dominic made clear that he's only addressing how much to charge, and there were 2 other parts to all of this: mechanisms for collection and governance arrangements for spending. The mechanisms for collection are probably going to be covered by specific regulations, but the methods for spending and the governance, we will be bringing a paper back to this committee before adoption, but after we've got this consultation underway. We're all very sensitive to the fact that if there are parishes, the mechanisms for spending are perhaps easier to describe. But for the Basingstoke town area, that doesn't apply. And it may well be that the town councillors within the town area will want to have a very direct influence either on the mechanisms and principles behind how the spending takes place, and maybe want to have a direct influence on specific spends from specific contributions. We don't know yet because we haven't had that discussion, but I want to reassure members that that will come back to this committee in due course, in case it's something that's troubling members. And I say that to all of you. Dominic wants to say something.
Please, Dominic.
Forgive me, I have been reminded there are in fact a couple more slides that I do need to show you. So forgive me for taking more of your time. Part of the testing we did was non-residential development. Testing these uses is still important, although in comparison to housing, there are going to be far fewer developments and therefore less opportunity to raise sill, but they are still part of the testing that we've done. In broad terms, the process is the same. We've collected evidence of values, we've collected evidence of costs, we've taken those through the workshop in July. Again, it's clear that build costs have increased substantially since 2013. Values have not increased to the same extent. There's also been a structural change in the grocery retail provision, which I'm sure you've have been aware of, really. So from the situation where retailers were providing larger and larger convenience retail, there's now been very much a move away from that and a move towards smaller retail units by the main four operators, as well as a growth in discounters, and also, I would say, a growth in premium food retailers as well. And that's had an impact on the values for retail units. So from the testing that we did, there are only two uses of the ones that I've showed you that were viable and potentially able to pay a sill, and they are budget hotel and out-of-centre comparison retail, and by that I mean things like retail warehouses and so on. And sort of including a buffer, we estimate that they would be able to pay both about £40 a square metre. Now, this is quite substantially less in most cases than the values we came up with in 2013, with the exception of budget hotels where they're roughly about the same. In 2013, we estimated that supermarkets would be able to pay quite a substantial sill, and that comparison retail would be able to pay a higher sill than we're now estimating. But as I said, that's due to primarily changes in build costs without any evidence, particularly of changes in values. That is now my final slide, and my apologies for that.
And just to finish up, I've got a slide on the timetable moving forward after committee. The views of this committee will be reported to Cabinet on Monday evening for their consideration of still moving forward. From Cabinet, it goes on to full council next week, and thereafter there will be a public consultation of 7 weeks during August and September, leading us up towards an examination in early 2017. This is when an inspector will look at our approach to seal to see if it meets the various tests. We anticipate the examiner's report coming out in March 2017, and we would like to think that we can be implementing seal as from July 2017. And just finally, there's the recommendation to the committee, which is to effectively note the findings of the viability work, to provide comments to the portfolio holder prior to Cabinet next week, and to endorse the proposals for public consultation moving forward. If I could just have an indication of anyone who'd like to speak, and then if I could make a request of committee members to try and limit themselves to 1 or 2 questions at a time, and we will come back if nobody else is indicating, but just to give everyone else an opportunity to speak as well. So, to start, Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you, Chair. Limiting me to 3 questions may be very difficult in this case. Okay, let's start from your number 6 on your. It was the one you called the blue screen at the back. No, that's it. You're on it. Yep. Okay. Right. I don't understand why you would put affordable housing in at the top and then take it off at the bottom. Why are you bothering to do that as a starting point? The total development cost, market and affordable minus, and then you go down to the bottom and say you take off the planning obligations, which are affordable housing. Why have you done it in that manner?
At the top, we're adding in the value of the affordable housing. So the affordable housing in this context is both, it has a value but also a cost, just as the market housing does as well. So the part of the value of a development in its totality will be the value of the affordable housing, which will be sold by the developer to a registered provider. Yeah, and that we model based on a capitalisation of the rents that that affordable housing will provide, which we've checked with RPs as well. So that's the process of assessing the value. But what we also then do is take off the cost of building it, which may be either greater or less than it can be sold for, depending on it. So it is basically, it's both sides of the equation. It's the values less the costs.
Okay, well that didn't help hugely, but okay. You, in part of this, you have noted that the local plan makes provision for housing. You take account of Basingstoke Town and Tadley in your estimations. Why haven't you looked at some of the outlying urban areas like Bramley, Overton, Whitchurch and Kingsclere, where I represent? Because if you looked at the council tax banding for places like Hatch Warren, they are substantially higher than parts of Kingsclere and Overton and Whitchurch. And therefore, why are we likely to pay £200 compared to an average in Basingstoke and Tadley of 140?
At an earlier part of the stage, we used a much finer grained version of that map, which we went through with council officers in trying to establish a reasonable balance between reflecting proper price differences within the borough against a reasonably workable and simple charging schedule. And this is in the light of the guidance, which does suggest that where possible, charging schedules should be kept simple. And through that process, it became apparent that, in broad terms, that the values in the rest of the borough are higher than those in Basingstoke and Tadley. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you will, of course, find local differences where, within Basingstoke, you will find dwellings selling for more than they are in the rural areas, and vice versa. So, there will be specific local variations, and the SIL charging schedule isn't trying to encompass all of those. It's saying, in broad terms, values are lower in Basingstoke and Tadley than they are in the rest of the borough. As part of the earlier work, we acknowledged that there are variations within that, but this is how it was decided to actually implement it.
So you're saying to me you'd rather have simplicity than actually get it right. Is that what you're implying? Because I don't see why these rural urban areas like Kingsclere, Overton, Whitchurch should be penalised. They are different. They are separate from the outlying areas like Headley, Ashford Hill, where I represent. We have a different mix and have a different feel to them, and perhaps a higher charge for building a house there is more representative. But I don't feel that these rural urban areas should be lumped in with the countryside when there is an obvious correlation between Kingsclere and Tadley. The council tax banding there is very similar, if you count in places like Balhurst and those areas. So I'm really not happy that we couldn't define it better to have some of those larger conurbations outside Tadley and Basingstoke included in the lower charges.
Briefly, Councillor James, please. Yeah.
I think, and what I would like to see as part of this piece of work really is that you did, that piece of work. I think you should have given us that to understand, because I have real concerns about the simplicity of this argument, and I support what is being said. And so, as a committee, I think that we should have seen that work that you did to understand it, because it worries me. And I think historically, going back some time, I think a couple of years ago, we were worried and said the same thing then. So it's not something new. We were saying that to you before, that it's too simple. Your argument's too simple. We were very concerned. I think all the committee at the time was very concerned about the logic around what you were presenting to us. So it worries me, and I guess other people are going to say the same thing. But I would have liked to have understood and seen that piece of work, really.
Mark?
I think ultimately it's a matter of how much information is available, because obviously if you go to some of the smaller settlements, you get fewer house sales that we can make comparisons with. Clearly, when you're looking at places like Basingstoke, you've got more scope to get a decent quantity upon which you can draw some kind of average, and that's the basis upon which we've undertaken the work.
Yes, I mean, I would say in a way, another way to look at it is, do you consider that having the higher sill rate for Whitchurch and Overton and so on means that development in those settlements is jeopardised? Because in a way that's the decision that you're being asked to take. And if you do consider that to be the case, then actually that would be the issue here, I think. I mean, I would say that the house price work was done. You can see the figures there. It's been through the developer workshop, where the development industry has had an opportunity to consider these value areas. And I would also say that these value areas, albeit with different prices attached to them, have also been through the local plan examination as well, where they were subject to independent scrutiny there as well.
Councillor Ruskin, I'll indulge you once more.
Thank you, Chair. You've marked down Basingstoke Golf Course as an £80 recommended charge. Now, we are well aware that they are going to build some substantive houses in there. The likelihood is that because it's a greenfield site, opportunity to link into the motorway, and it seems tough actually that it's not viable at £140, and we could have a greater share of money to improve the junction onto the M3 if that's what we choose to do. I just want some thoughts on why there's a £60 reduction on that.
There is a buffer there. The argument for having a larger buffer on strategic sites is that there is a greater likelihood that the costs associated with developing them may change. And because the strategic sites are fundamental to delivery of your local plan, that's why we've recommended a larger buffer there. It's within your gift to not follow these recommendations and to take forward a different sill rate. These can only be my recommendations to you. But that's, I've tried to be transparent and explain why we've recommended that there is a substantial buffer for the strategic sites, including the golf course. Can I just ask Mark to outline the transport improvements that have been costed in? So whilst I have the figures in front of me, I don't recollect the details of the junction improvements that are being considered.
For Hampton Fields and the golf course, which are obviously opposite sides of the A30, we're aware that Hampton Fields is coming forward sooner in the planning process, and because of that, it needs to provide the infrastructure it requires more quickly than the golf course does. It's therefore effectively footing the bill, Hampton Fields this is, for a large-scale roundabout that will serve both sites, and that's why we see that the Hampton Fields viability level is so much lower there compared to the golf course. The golf course is effectively getting off to some extent scot-free compared to Hampton Fields, which is because of its phasing, footing most of the bill.
On that point, therefore, shouldn't you then put some additional costs into the Basingstoke Golf Club site so as it is paying its fair share? That's what it seems to me.
I suppose it's because when Hampton Fields is actually built out, it will deliver that roundabout, and that roundabout will also provide access to the golf course. So in essence, the golf course is benefiting from Hampton Fields coming forward so much sooner. We can't add further add a further still requirement to that purely on that basis. I think it comes back to the buffer point that Dominic was making.
Can I just clarify on that then, using Chairman's indulgence as I may? Hampton Fields, and given what we've just said, the golf course is going off, we're obviously setting different sill rates for different sites, but I think what you've just said is we can't set different sill rates for Hampton Fields and the golf course, or can we set right? So why can't we set a higher sill rate for the golf course in light of the fact that it's not providing that?
We have set out a higher sill rate for the golf course compared to Hampton Fields.
Right, Councillor Parker, let's.
Sorry, just on a point of clarification, the roundabout is being provided for by Section 106, which is obviously still a cost to development, but not through the SIL monies raised.
Councillor Parker.
Well, I'm at the other end of the scale. I'm trying to understand the justification for all flatted developments to have a zero sill rate. My understanding is that in terms of commercial viability on developments, if you can stack them high, you get a better profit. And we seem to be saying it's more costly. I note the point is made with regard to undercroft car parking, but there have been some developments in this town that are totally flatted, and under the basis of sustainability, because of the central location, there's been no provision for car parking at all.
It is certainly true that in some situations flatted development can be very viable. It tends to be viable where values are high, where it makes sense to overcome the higher build costs associated with flats because of the additional valuable floor space. But once the sweet spot of the comparison between the values of flats and the build cost is changed, then flats are not particularly viable. And it seems to me that, as I said, in Basingstoke, we tested 3 permutations of flatted development from £90 or thereabouts per, 90 dwellings per hectare up to 180, and all, 2 out of 3 were really not viable, and those are the ones with the undercroft car parking. And with the scheme that didn't provide any car parking, it just came over the benchmark. So potentially could have afforded a very small sill, but on balance, it seemed to me that most flatted schemes would be obliged to provide some form of car parking, and there was a very marginal case for saying that it could afford any sill on that basis. So that was the thinking behind that. And I think, if I understand correctly, the current proposals or current proposed scheme for flats in Basingstoke is dependent on public funds for site preparation in order to allow that scheme to proceed, which by itself is only anecdotal evidence, but would certainly seem to sit reasonably comfortably with the viability findings that we've produced.
If I may, I understand that on the regeneration of Basin View, whilst there's not a firm policy in terms of this, but some of the recent assessments of how that could progress in terms of further regeneration, that mix of commercial, retail and residential element would make this a more viable proposition. So it's a difficult one for maybe the lay person to take on board, that there's no money in building flats, because there's got to be a profit, and in terms of, in that very small area, there is considerable inconvenience caused, need for improvements in certain transport facilities and so forth, and for there to be no contribution at all, I think we're selling ourselves cheap.
I suppose there's just a couple of points to make. I think it's probably worth looking back at the last couple of years to see what has been delivered in terms of flatted schemes. And most of them have not been new build schemes. Most of them have been conversions of old office accommodation. So we're not seeing the types of development we may have seen 4, 5, 6 years ago when we saw Skyline Plaza built, we saw Crown Heights, and where things have come forward, they've struggled in terms of viability, like the old Brook House sites. Thinking about the impacts point you made around the impact of a development, say on Basing View, there would, in many cases, still be a requirement for Section 106 funds to be provided, where there was a need to mitigate the impact of that development, and that's something that we would still continue to seek. If that development is causing an impact, then we would look for some kind of contribution or improvement to address and overcome that point.
Councillor Parker.
Is there the alternative of 106? Is that a continuation into the future, or is there some time limit on it?
106 will continue to be applied where there is an impact arising as a result of that development. And so if you need to mitigate that development, then the mitigation will be secured through either 106 or Section 278 agreement if it's in relation to highways.
Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my questions, can I just pick up on that train of thought? It totally depends, doesn't it, on whether or not you think flatted development should be contributing through SIL to the strategic issues that we face, or whether you think, okay, each flatted development should consume its own smoke as part of Section 106 in its immediate area. If we say that, and this is the issue, and we're all agreeing this, I think colleagues are saying the same thing, the simplicity of this and the sense of having sweeping statements being made is one thing, and I understand why you've done it, but to push back a bit, there is more than one market. There are luxury flats that are luxury one-bed flats. There are equal small flats that are contributing as well. But a developer will bring forward, depending upon what their scheme is, a variety of options that we will see. The other key point to this is it shapes development. How we shape this, how we set this out, will actually shape what developers will bring forward. And what concerns me is by zero rating 100% flats, you are inviting developers to bring forward seriously sized flatted development on Basing View, which will have a different value in the town centre as to what may on the edge of the town centre, out with near the hospital, for example. We're inviting that because we're saying, don't worry, you'll get away with 0% SIL. And reflecting back, all you'll have to worry about is consuming your site's own smoke against Section 106 contributions. I think that's very dangerous. And in a sense, we're giving the landowner a free ticket in that respect, let alone the developer. Chair, if I could ask two questions and then come back if that's all right. What got me about part of the presentation was the opportunity cost issue of developers face, Section 106 negotiable and SIL being non-negotiable. And then you saying that you took the average profit, if you like, the average element of the developer's profit to be about 20%. Most developers would be very happy to walk away with about 16%. That's the average that most sites do walk away with in the industry. We all say 20%, and they sure as hell come in with their viability assessments at 20%, and we see that at planning committee day in, day out. You know, you can see that in the way they go about their processes. But most will actually be very happy with a 16 to 17% return. That 3% is very significant if we're talking about these figures. So I just wondered how far we've tested that, or whether we're just accepting it as the industry standard, because I'd like to see that actually tested a bit more, as my first question.
Thank you, yes. Well, in principle, I agree with you. I think that for many schemes, either through the way they work out or sometimes through intent, developers will proceed on lower rates of return. However, I think there is a reality that there isn't enough evidence, hard evidence, to prove that, and it would be very unlikely to get through an examination. So that would be a fairly simple reason for saying we are acknowledging that developer returns may be acceptable below the rates that we've modelled at. I would say as well there is one sort of recent set of factors which may just be short-term or maybe long-term, I don't know. The principle of a developer return is that it is a profit, but it's also a return for the risk that they take. And arguably development since late June is now much more riskier than it was before. Now, whether that's a good reason or not, I don't know, but I'm sure it's going to form a substantive part of the representations about the SIL charging schedule that we receive as part of it. I think there is a reality, though, that development is risky. Earlier on, I explained that the viability is a combination of two very large numbers, and it only takes a small movement for schemes to go very badly wrong. And that's why the development industry argues that it needs, certainly on market housing, to have a return of about 20%, and generally they will argue for more than 20%. It's actually fighting quite a hard battle to persuade examiners that 20% is sufficient, when they will have development industry lining up to say that their banks allegedly require them to provide more. The development industry will also argue that they require the same return on affordable housing as well, despite the fact that it's much less risky. So what I'm coming back to is that at 20% is defendable at examination. I think 17.5%, which is probably more realistic, would be really difficult, and 16% would be nigh on impossible, is in my view.
I respect that. I understand what you're saying. I find it really hard to take, though, from the very simple point of view. That is reality. And when we talk about risk and we talk about development, we want to be a growth area in Basingstoke. That's the decision the local plan's made. Developers are going to be interested in developing in Basingstoke, and the government are pushing it in that direction, regardless of Brexit, regardless of all those other risk issues, which I understand. We are still sticking a flagpole in Basingstoke and saying, please come and develop here. We've got 13,000 houses to develop in the next period. Look, second question really relates to Manydown, and I'm concerned to see Manydown included in the SIL ratio compared to what we were talking about before when we rated it as nil, for all the reasons we rated it as nil. And without wanting to unpack them in this committee as compared to what we've spoken about in the Manydown Overview Committee, I would be very concerned to see Manydown suddenly appearing with that kind of SIL rating compared to the sort of development and the sort of aspiration we have for that site, where we previously said we can deliver this through Section 106. It makes me wonder who's driving that. Where is that coming from? If it's coming from county to offset its Section 106, if it's coming from other sources, then that's a concern. I don't understand. If it is just your simple calculation, that's one thing. I understand that, and maybe I'm seeing too much into it. But I am looking for the hand of county in this, in some respects, in terms of what they want to deliver on Manydown.
Dominic, would you like to come back, or Councillor Fell, have you got anything to say on that?
It is just purely my calculation. Purely the difference is market values. Build costs have gone up, but not as much. It's actually the value of affordable housing has actually gone up since we last tested it as well, actually, which is significant and important. And interest rates have come down, and the combination of those factors has meant that development overall has become more viable in Basingstoke and Deane. As I said before, though, there are risks for Manydown, as there are for all of the strategic sites, that because of their importance to the delivery of the local plan, I think they deserve significant scrutiny about whether a SIL rate may jeopardise development on strategic sites. And I think, I can't tell you what you should think, but I think you need to be very careful about the strategic sites, really, because they are, if you like, for me, the highest risk element.
Thank you. My view, for what it's worth, is that I don't think we should be charging. I don't think we should. I think we should zero rate SIL on Manydown on the basis of what we've said. It is not the same as the others. It is not the same. And if we're saying that the values have increased, then the ability for us to achieve our aspirations on Manydown form part of this. Now, I want to understand that. I'd like to explore that with officers outside of this meeting. I don't think it's necessary to unpack here, but it is an important question we need to ask ourselves. Really important. If we want to see the things realised on Manydown that we want, for example, affordable housing, the percentage we want, in the manner we want it to be delivered, and the kind of development we want to see, as wearing both hats, both as landowner and as the LPA, I think it's a very important question to ask ourselves if we should be even doing the SIL on the very basis of the argument we gave before.
I'm not sure there was a question there, so Councillor Frost.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like, it's more of a comment really, but I do actually share the concerns of my other colleagues on committee about the sheer simplicity of the model. I do like things to be simple because then it's very understandable, but I think sometimes we can get too simple. And I'm sure that that my residents of Oakley and North Waltham Ward will applaud a higher sill charge, certainly as this will increase the bar of viability in my ward within the shadow of the carbuncle of the new hospital that is going to be built.
Councillor Watts.
Thank you, Chair. Carrying on with the flatted developments, zero seal, what evidence have we looked for other authorities? What have they been setting for their seal rates for flatted areas?
I think that's a very good question. Most of the ways that it's been dealt with elsewhere that I'm aware of has been actually by geography rather than by type of development. So, for example, there's one other authority that I'm working for which also has aspirations for regeneration of part of its sort of central urban area, and they've essentially, it's only suitable for flatted development, and they've zoned that as a zero rate, also with a lower affordable housing rate as well. Mark, yeah, actually, Mark, would you like to talk to that one actually? So I've got partial evidence, and Mark's got some more thoughts. Beg your pardon.
I really can't quote the exact rates, but I'm conscious that Maidenhead, as in Windsor of Maidenhead, has lower sill rates in the central area of Maidenhead, given the regeneration that's taking place there, and the fact that most of the development that will take place will be flatted schemes.
Useful to get some more evidence from other areas, I think, maybe?
Well, could I also just make the point and support Councillor Watts that Maidenhead is actively seeking to redevelop its central area in a different way, I think, to the way that, I mean, basically it's a different offer. I think I'd certainly agree and commend what Councillor Watts is saying, that actually we need to look at what other local authorities are doing in terms of flat development, because they are different offers compared to what Basingstoke's offering.
I think it's probably worth saying Dominic's based the work on local evidence, though, and obviously, as you say, rightfully say, Maidenhead has a different background, different land values, and so on. So I think the work that Dominic's undertaken on this and looking at 3 different case studies has confirmed the view that it's not viable to require still payments for flatted schemes, taking into account our desire to have 40% affordable housing on these sites.
Yeah, I'd like to get on to site specifics, really. Sort of Handsome Fields. There's an outline application gone in. In the papers, it mentions there's 14 million being set aside for infrastructure monies. Obviously, a lot of that's going to be 106 monies. But if that application has gone through, outline application, it's going to be approved within the next year. We're not going to get any seal money. So how much money would we lose if that was given, and what knock-on effects would that have for it's like 5.5 million for a roundabout up there? How much seal would we lose?
It's difficult to calculate that here and now, but obviously we will still achieve the roundabout because that will be provided through the Section 106, so we don't need to worry about that so much. But ultimately, the value that we'll achieve through taking forward the site through Section 106 and the amount of money that we'll achieve through SIL plus the residual 106 will be broadly around the same, I think. It's probably fair to say.
The modelling we undertook for Handsome Fields did include £14 million of infrastructure costs to be delivered through Section 106, and I haven't seen the detail of the outline application, but it seems to me as if those items of infrastructure are included within that.
Councillor James.
I want to talk about flats as well. So just to understand again what you were saying about the viability, ensuring in relation to flats that we would deliver the 40% affordable housing. Once it goes to, so that's the seal rate, but once it goes to DC, they can then say that it's not viable to deliver the 40% affordable, and there's in relation to the local plan, there's a get out of jail, isn't there? So they can, so then we could end up with no seal rate, but also no affordable housing, or we could look at them delivering affordable housing elsewhere. Is that right?
Well, the starting point in the policy, the adopted policy, is that 40% affordable housing should be provided on site, and that's where we start the discussion effectively with applicants. And that's what they should be providing in submitting proposals to us.
But I see on the map for Basingview, and Basingview are looking at flatted development which hasn't got affordable housing in it. It's a different model, but it's not affordable housing. And so that's what worries me. I just think that as a committee we should understand this in more detail. I really have some concerns, and I would like us to really look at this as a piece of work, because we obviously all across the party have concerns about these factors. I think it's going to shape, as Paul says, I think it's going to shape future development. Maybe that's what this authority wants. I don't know in relation to growth. I don't know that it is, and we've always had some concerns around flatted development. But I just want to understand the issue of viability when it comes to development. So this is viability in relation to fill, but then you can prove that it's not viable. I know it's a starting point, but we have seen through a very few developments that have actually come forward in DC that actually delivers on our policy, in fact. And I think that would be important to look at that as a piece of work, and we have as a Labour group, and we have failed miserably in relation to the delivery of our affordable housing. And I think I'd like possibly outside of this that you send us the details on that against flats and what has been delivered against affordable housing. Sorry.
Thank you. Just in case it's helpful, within the full report that we produced on page 40, there is a summary of the residual values for the case studies, or for some of the case studies in Basingstoke and Tadley. And case studies 8, 9, and 10 and 11 are flats. And
78 and page 40.
But yeah, big
78 and 40.
Yes, okay. And you can see here that the third column along has got the residual value per hectare for the schemes that we modelled. And you can see that, beg pardon, case study 9 is a sheltered accommodation, so probably we should put that to one side for the purposes of this. You can see that the 90, case study 8, high density flats, just scrapes over the benchmark of £1 million per hectare. Case study 10, which is 100 flats but with undercroft parking, doesn't have a positive residual at all. And case study 11, which is 100 flats with surface parking, does have a positive value, but it's below the benchmark of £1 million. It has a positive value of £605,000 per hectare. And sort of when I look at those figures, I can see that it's quite likely that flatted developments in Basingstoke would be coming forward, probably with some combination of the case study 10 and case study 11, to say, woe is me, our development's not very viable, we can't afford to provide any or not much affordable housing. And again, I would not necessarily find that surprising given what I've seen elsewhere for flatted developments coming forward, where, for example, I think I remember just a fortnight ago, Ashford, I think it was, approved 600 flats with no affordable housing in their town centre. I know, again, you can't deal by anecdote, and that's in some respects not helpful, but Ashford and Basingstoke, I would argue, do have some comparisons. And, the fact that they let that one go in Ashford doesn't mean to say you would want to let it go here. But it's part of a broader picture that makes it unsurprising for me to hear from you your concerns about affordable housing in Basingstoke.
So in relation to Basingview, because what we're being told, it is not viable to to see 40% affordable housing come forward. Under this model, you're telling us against our policy requirement, we should be expecting, and we need to stick to that we expect 40% affordable housing in that flattened development in Basingstoke.
I think from the case studies we've got here, one of the case studies will be able to provide affordable housing, and the other two would be providing no affordable housing, or, well, actually no, neither of the other two would be providing affordable housing on the figures we've got here.
I think it comes back to the point that the policy sets out the position of the Borough Council that we seek 40%, and if they feel that there's a viability case to argue, then it's within their gift to submit information to us, which we will consider if they wish to depart from that. But our starting point is always 40%.
Councillor Rustigan.
Thank you. Just on the flatted thing, maybe I suggest something that might be quite useful: a zero sill threshold only on ocean view properties in Basingstoke. That might be one way of getting around it. I have some obvious questions about. You said there's scale savings on. There aren't scale savings on greenfield sites. When you've got the site at the golf course, it connects very well to Hatchwarren and the other developments up there. So I'm surprised that you don't get scale savings in some of those developments. Obviously, Manidown is over the side of a road and is a completely new development, but you could attach the golf club site to the existing housing that abuts it.
The costs we've modelled for the golf course do take into account that the infrastructure required, for example, not having to meet the cost of the roundabout that Hanson Fields is making, means that the golf course is more viable than some of the other strategic sites, certainly. One of the things that one should take into account is that whilst we've used the same land value benchmark for the golf course as for Manidown, £400,000 per hectare, the golf course is actually a more valuable use than agricultural land. It's probably worth about twice as much as agricultural land. Now, that's still a long way less than the benchmark that we've used, but it is worthwhile bearing in mind when one's setting a sill rate for the golf course that they are starting from the perspective of a more valuable site in its current use. Because should that site go to appeal, they will be making that point, and I think it's important that it's recognised when we're setting a sill for that site.
In it, you have in the report you have outlined that the council can use up to 5% of the sill receipts to cover administration levies. We already administer 106 money and will continue to do so. I just want to know how many extra officers or how much capital or income is going to be deployed to pay for those administration costs.
Initially, the focus for any admin fee that we take will be to pay for the software and the additional staff resource that we'll take to set up the system, because we've learnt from speaking to other authorities that almost introducing SIL is the easy part. It's the actual collection and admin processes and establishing all that behind the scenes, which is the really time-consuming and difficult processes that we'll need to go through. So initially we will need to buy some computer software. We'll need to ensure that all staff and members are trained in the processes, and that we have everything in place ready to go for when we actually introduce SIL in July 2017.
Councillor Watts.
In the report, point 2 goes about infrastructure funding gap, 114 million pounds. I just wonder how much money this authority has actually lost when developers have actually got through appeals like Kennel Farm and Razors, and because it just says here we've secured funding through planning obligations. Just wonder how much money we have lost, 106 money.
When applications are determined through the appeal process, we don't actually lose money in terms of Section 106. We still secure the Section 106 because that's an issue that the inspector will consider in determining any appeal. So, you know, that's not a particular concern for us.
Thank you. The shortfall in funding, with all the SIL monies, we've sort of added it up. There's still going to be a shortfall of about 75 million. If my math is correct. Where are we going to find that 75 million from?
Sorry. We will need to continue our to-date successful approach of speaking to the LEP and securing funds that we've achieved to date. That's an important source of income for the Borough Council. We have attracted a significant income through New Homes Bonus in the past few years, and whilst there's some uncertainty as to how long that will continue, it is continuing at the moment, so there'll be that income through New Homes Bonus in addition to the LEP. We're aware that the capital programme of the County Council, although perhaps slightly more limited than it has been in the past, will need to step in some cases, and there'll be funding from private sector organisations such as utility companies and in addition to the NHS for the provision of services in the borough. So whilst we can't hope to fill the gap through SIL, and we shouldn't effectively be doing so because it wouldn't justify SIL, there are other sources of income and we'll need to be on the front foot in bidding for those.
Can I just follow up? Mark, you might have the figures. I think I heard them this morning correctly that we've received somewhere near 30 million for infrastructure over the last 3-4 years or something.
That's correct. That's mainly from the LEP and Department for Transport.
I just heard it today. I was just pleased I knew what it was. Councillor Watts, did you have any more questions?
To do with the timing, Kennel Farm's being built at the moment. The children from Kennel Farm are going to go to school in Southam. There's provision for a school in Hampton Fields. What's the timing for this? I mean, we've got funding for school improvements in Park View. Money's been allocated, but money's been allocated up to 2019. But I can't. How many years is that particular area, the Hatchwarren Beggarwood area, going to wait for a school? And how? Basically, it all ties in. We haven't got secured funding for. We've got secured funding for the school. We haven't got secured funding for the infrastructure. We've got no money's been allocated to the A30, the Hatchwarren roundabout. We've got some money for Brighton Hill roundabout. So we've got money for the school improvement, but we've got no money to improve the roads. So it's catch-22.
The County Council have currently got a bid with the Enterprise M3 LEP for improvements to the A30, so we're hopeful that is successful. Bids to date have been successful, so we'll continue to keep an eye on how that's progressing. We understand that the LEP will be making an announcement about funding in the autumn time this year.
Councillor Harvey.
Thanks, Chair. Just going to page 12 and 13 of the report, payments in kind, 3.31 and 3.32. I'd just like to understand a little bit more about what we're actually saying here, or what the regulation is actually saying about payments in kind, in terms of somebody offering this authority, here, have this land in lieu of, and what does that actually mean? And then how the matter would be managed, or how you would make the judgment, what process or criteria might you apply to decide whether or not you would accept it. I mean, just want a little bit more information on that to understand it, if you can.
I'm afraid I don't know a huge amount of detail around that, but there will certainly be a need for an independent valuation of what the offer is to make sure that that's valid and is representative of the market before we can consider taking that forward with an individual application. But if you like, I can get you more detail on that outside the meeting.
If I could just, Rebecca.
Just to say, Councillor Harvey, I think that's something we could certainly bring forward as part of the wider discussions around seal distribution, how that would be dealt with. So I think that should be brought forward as part of that paper, what that policy might look like for members to discuss.
So are we saying that that would be something as part of the planning process, or are we saying that's something up front in the... So where does it fit in? Because if we're going to negotiate with somebody, bringing forward, say, a planning application that says, I wish to develop this, I can't pay still, but I'll offer you this land, that's one thing. But if we're setting it on a strategic context, so somebody's saying, here's this big strategic development, I mean, that's what I was trying to understand.
It would be part of that initial process, but it's a standard thing. So it's not something we're introducing. It's just an option that could be used instead, and that's standard for all local authorities introducing still. So I think we probably need to bring forward some further information for members to consider that.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And secondly, on 14 and 15, it talks about in 4.6, we're talking about affordable housing and about small sites. As I've understood it, if I've understood this, what it's saying is that small sites, in effect, would be able to get away with not providing affordable housing, and then the SIL rate wouldn't be adjusted. You have the SIL anyway, but it doesn't, in a sense, that's allowing a lot of very small developments or medium-sized developments, considering what we're talking about, to actually get away with providing no affordable housing. Yeah, and in some villages, you could see that having actually quite an important impact. You can have 10 units coming forward where you might get 1 or 2 affordable houses. That could be incredibly important. I'm just concerned about that, and I'd like to understand it more.
Yeah, clearly the changes to the affordable housing thresholds have been set at a national level, and we're just applying what's happening nationwide. The work that Dominic has undertaken confirms that there is viability in smaller sites. However, we are keen to make sure that SIL's in place as quickly as possible, so that we can capture sites that are coming forward through the planning process at the moment. And rather than delaying this process at present, it's perhaps something that we can come back to at a later stage. We're conscious that there's further work to be undertaken on starter homes once further information comes out from the government on how that will work. So it's something that we can perhaps wrap up in the future review of SIL. But as I say, our priority right now is to get SIL in place ASAP.
I understand that, but I guess if you've got a village and you've got a site coming forward for 10 units, that might be the only actual application you see in years in the context of provision. And if we're going to say, right, we're going to wait for the starter homes, well, the starter homes might not be meeting the need that's required in the village, that might want affordable rent or social rent, or might require a different product. And my worry is, yeah, we're going to rush to get the SIL, I understand that, but if we're not covering this off, we might be doing serious damage to that community in the context of seeing or not the affordable housing in the way we would want to.
It would still be, Section 106 would still be suitable for those small sites, but of course it would just be mitigating the impacts of the site. So it would be restricted, but there would still be some gain from the development. Yes.
So we're back into the negotiating realm, we're back into developers doing the usual routine. It's whichever way you look at this, that particular circumstance does undercut potentially where we want to be.
Councillor James.
Mine was also picking up on the payment in kind. And is that also linking it to the policy where if a development developer doesn't want to deliver affordable housing on a site, they can give a payment in kind as well? So there is the 2 payments in kind, isn't there?
Again, the policy requirement is that the affordable housing should be provided on site unless there are exceptional reasons as to why that shouldn't take place, and that's set out in policy CM1 of the adopted local plan.
But in relation to developers, and we had concerns in relation to the local plan, we're seeing sites come forward where they're saying they're not going to deliver on that site, but they give you money in kind. I'd quite like to understand it more, but I'd also like us as a committee to look at how we monitor payment in kind, as in, at the moment, where a developer hasn't delivered that on site, how do I follow and monitor what's in the pot? You know, where in the council, where can I go at the moment to see, and this is moving away slightly from SIL, but where do I go to see what is there and where is it being held? How accountable is that?
That's information that's held by the Borough Council, so it can be made available to you, you know, upon request. If there's a particular site or particular issue, then feel free to come to us and we can assist.
But what I quite like is, because it could be, and I've seen sites where this is happening, it's building, so there's this whole shopping list of money that's there, I don't want to come to, I want to be able to go somewhere and see. I want us to be able to look at, God, look at all that money that's there. Why is it there when we would like to deliver it on this site or add it to this site to up our affordable housing? We need to be able to see that and see it in its greatest form, because it is growing all the time, and I want to be able to go to that and look at, because the site in my ward is only going to deliver 34% affordable housing. Therefore, I want to ensure that it delivers the 40. There's this amount of money in the pot that I want to add to it, you know, and I want to be able to challenge this administration and officers as to why they haven't delivered 40% affordable in my ward in this site, because there's this money in the pot.
Can I bring in Rebecca?
Just to say that that is a piece of work that we're doing at the moment in terms of member engagement and involvement in Section 106 across the board, including the affordable housing element. So I would suggest that we bring something back to have that wider discussion, as it's slightly separate to the steel discussion we're having today. But absolutely, your concerns are very much noted, and we are working on that now.
And I know it's just been said, but the reason that's happening is because you've raised this before. So it just takes a while to go through the machine, but it's coming.
Councillor Golding. Councillor Barker, briefly.
I understand what officers are saying, and that the portfolio holder is promising, but really and truly, the requests for better understanding, involvement and engagement by ward councillors on Section 106 money was a plea made back in 2004. We're 11 years on, nearly 12 years on now, and so I would ask Rebecca, please, can we not just have a promise that this is work we're doing? Can we perhaps have a timescale set for it to be completed?
So I think we'd be looking to bring something back in the autumn. We've got the bones of a report and a potential structure that engages members, and we're just kind of finalising that, and I think we'd be looking to bring something back towards autumn with the Chair's agreement.
Councillor James.
On reflection, what I was saying, it wasn't about 106, because it could be that Bramley, for example, wasn't going to deliver affordable housing on a site, which it didn't, and therefore there's this big pot of money available that was in kind, that is floating around somewhere. I just want to know, strategically, how much money is there, because that isn't about me and my ward and how you engage with me in relation to 106, but I strategically want to know what the borough has, how much is there, where it came from, but ultimately I want to know how much is in the pot, because I want to be able to grab some of that to deliver more affordable housing in urban areas where we want it.
Thank you. Councillor Golding.
Thank you. My main concerns when reading this report is that there's just such a discrepancy between our strategic site fill charges and our kind of proposed charges. And we've talked a lot about kind of what schemes won't be viable. What sort of schemes do you think will be viable? What sort of case studies have you done?
With the exception of the single dwelling sites, all of the case studies from 2 dwellings through to 100 dwellings of sort of general market and affordable housing have been viable. And as we talked earlier on, the exceptions really have been the flatted development. And that viability is seen across Basingstoke and Tadley, and also the rural rest of the borough as well, and the market towns. So yes, essentially most forms of small and medium-sized development are shown to be viable. There will still, I'm sure, be specific sites which will have constraints outside that which we've modelled, which may not be. But in essence, development in the borough is viable. The changes only start to come into play where, for the larger scale developments, additional costs have to be included. Okay, it's being gauged against a lower benchmark land value, but those additional costs make quite an impact on the viability, and also the long time frame for development as well.
Can I follow up? So for the larger development, so like the 100 houses, is that based purely on them paying CIL and no Section 106, or is there room for us to charge for both?
Both, but Section 106 is limited. Section 106 is at £1,500 per dwelling. So if you like, when we do the modelling, we build in the Section 106 cost of £1,500 per dwelling already, and then we see what is left over to be shared between the landowner and the council in terms of CIL. So the Section 106 is already in there. This £1,500 is a nominal amount that, in discussion with the council officers, was seen to be a reasonable, typical sum that might be asked for local site mitigation. Now, it is likely that the reality will be either side of that. I suspect that some developments will pay none because they create few impacts, whereas others will have much more of an impact and they will pay more, really. So, and it may well be that if a site, for whatever reason, has got a particularly large Section 106 requirement to mitigate its impact, it might start claiming viability and trying to negotiate affordable housing or whatever it needs to remain viable.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you. I'd just quickly like to echo the points that Councillor James and Councillor Harvey made on payments in kind. I think there needs to be some more work done around there on engagement. And sort of on that point, I'm quite concerned if we go to page 15, which is on neighbourhood portion, I'm quite concerned about the amount that's paid or not paid to parish councils and local communities. I understand the incentives behind a neighbourhood plan and saying that, you know, we give parishes an extra 10% if they have a neighbourhood plan. However, lots of parishes won't have a neighbourhood plan when lots of these sites come forward. So that's a concern. Wootton St Lawrence, which is in my ward, has 260 houses there. So if you take the £100 limit, that gives you a theoretical CIL cap of £26,000. We talk about £60 per square foot on many down at 100 square metres per house. You actually end up with a theoretical CIL cap of 4 houses. We're not talking about 4 houses, we're talking about 3,400 houses. So I'd just like to know where we're going to get to on consultation with local community, with parish councils, on not just the 15 to 25% that we're talking about, but on the rest of the money. And I'm conscious that it's actually worse for the guys in the town, because at least the parish councils get 15 to 25% capped or uncapped. The town guys actually don't see that at all.
I think this is one of those areas that we need to come back to, and I think as we mentioned previously that we're concentrating at the moment on establishing really the CIL rates, and then we'll come back to look at processes of spending and prioritisation subsequently. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps, with the Chair's permission, perhaps that's something that needs to come back to this committee as soon as possible.
I think Councillor Raphael outlined that from the off, that actually, yes, we will have a piece of work that comes back to say how we spend the money, and I think that's completely correct, and we've just got to get some money in first. Councillor Richards.
Can I also add a point there? That also will include this regulation 123 list, because we haven't had any discussion on that either. I mean, I haven't brought it up because I gather that's not on the agenda for today, but it's in the papers. It's in the papers, yes, but I thought you just wanted to concentrate on the charging schedule. Otherwise, I would just like an explanation as to how that list was put together, the draft list that's there.
Councillor Raphael.
Well, Chairman, it was part of the local plan, the infrastructure delivery plan, and we did discuss it at this committee previously what would be on the 1, 2, 3 list. So although Councillor Rich may feel that he hasn't got an opportunity to discuss it at the moment, it has been discussed before and thrashed out, and that's why it's there. But Mr. Lambert will indicate a bit more on that, because it may be that we can adjust it. I don't know.
I mean, what Councillor Raffel says is correct. It flows from what's in the infrastructure delivery plan, and so we've effectively gone through the IDP to see which items we feel should be provided through Section 106 or SIL, and that's therefore just reflected in the Regulation 123 list, which is Appendix 2 to the report. Yes, right. Just to confirm a point Councillor Fell's making, that we are able to adjust the Regulation 123 list in time without going through the full-blown examination process that we have to with SIL itself. It's easy to adapt it in that sense.
Sorry, can I also confirm then? I was not aware it had been discussed, but thanks for that explanation. Were the, for instance, parish councils involved in this as well? Did they get a chance to give their inputs?
Each time the local plan's been consulted upon, the infrastructure plan sitting behind it has been consulted upon as well. So effectively, yes, two or three times at least.
Councillor Rattigan.
Thank you. It's on the draft 123. At what point do we prioritise these, the wish list, if I can put it that way? And where will we get the member involvement for the things that affect our wards, our communities, and the people we represent? Obviously, I'd be delighted to put the two Kingsclear elements to 1 and 2 in the sports, but I'm quite happy to take anybody else's view on it.
I'm sure Mark's about to come back, but I think what we've agreed, and just to outline for the sake of clarity, is that today we're talking about the first part of the three, as Dominic outlined. I think it's absolutely right that we have a paperback here to outline how we are going to spend SIL, and that's how we're going to spend it. That includes prioritisation, that includes the 15-25%, how we deal with it in the town, particularly as you can imagine as a ward member for Winkery, I'm quite interested in. I think we need to have a piece of work done on that comes back to this committee for a serious discussion. Councillor Ashfield.
Hi there. I'm interested around getting some clarification on the timing. Whitchurch doesn't have a neighbourhood plan at the moment, but we're hoping that will be adopted perhaps December or January. It's very possible that our allocation could be fully given permission by the time this comes into place. And certainly one of the things I know that our neighbourhood plan team has sold is this uplift to the 25%. But am I right in understanding that actually might not actually come to fruition if the housing has already been allocated before, if the house has been allocated before July?
Yes, effectively, if the site's got planning permission before SIL is introduced, then it won't be still liable, and we'll deal with it through the Section 106 process. If, however, permission is granted after SIL's in place, then that will become still liable, and we'll benefit in that sense.
Are you expecting any disruption around the time of SIL introduction in terms of planning applications that are going through?
From experience in other authorities, I understand that there probably will be a rush to get Section 106s signed before they become still liable, I should imagine. So we'll be working closely with our legal colleagues to make sure that they're sufficiently resourced to.
Councillor Harvey.
Can I just pick up on that point then? If we've experienced developers coming to development control saying, pleading poverty, pleading all the rest of it, how are we going to deal with that overlap? Because the Section 106 obligations running into that mad rush, which we're likely to see, understandably so, is going to be huge. And a lot of, I mean, when we look at the strategic sites in the previous paper, in our actual agenda paper, it lists the major strategic sites that have already got away with it because they're not going to pay SIL. And a lot of their Section 106s, and I know colleagues in other wards, Chinham is a good example in terms of what they're having to face, their Section 106 contributions from those sites aren't going to meet necessarily the expectations we had of the infrastructure that was required. So what I'm concerned about, I guess, is if there's a mad rush, how can we embolden our legal department and our officers? I don't think this is with the members, it's more with the officers being able to argue our case. So we can actually hold the line on some of this, because some of the villages and some of the town area is going to really suffer on the back of this if we're not careful.
Can I answer that? It's obvious that we have to do our part and get SIL going. We can't clearly Councillor Harvey wasn't suggesting this, but we can't delay worrying about the consequence of a problem that's inevitably going to arise. We have to get on with it and cope. Every application is clearly going to be judged on its merits, and I don't think it'd be right for this committee to start trying to suggest how things should be done differently. And I don't, whilst it's a perfectly proper question, suggestion, I think we'll just have to leave it that they will do their best and judge each application on its merits.
I don't disagree with the Cabinet just said, but I guess my point is the resource issue. Talking to a member of the legal profession in that context, we need staffing in this authority in enough capacity, obviously, to defend the issues that will be presented. And if you're going into appeals facing QCs who have been given all the evidence on behalf of developers through their viability assessments and challenging us on these matters, we need to be able as an authority to defend our position for our communities in those developments that try and rush to beat the deadline. It's not the timetable of the SIL that I'm worried about. It's about how we deal with what will present itself in the meanwhile. You're not going to answer that tonight, I appreciate it, but it's one that I think you need to take away, and officers need to think about how we properly defend the position.
I can say we've got the appropriate officers here to reflect on that if the issues arise.
Councillor James.
Slightly odd question, but in relation to a developer that doesn't put forward a site for adoption, roads and open space, could we set a higher seal rate so that we discourage developers from doing that?
SIL isn't intended to provide a policy tool, so we shouldn't be trying to influence developers through the SIL process. So effectively the answer to that is no, I think.
Why not? Why can't SIL be, why not?
That's within the government regulations. It's not there to influence policy, or policy shouldn't influence SIL. SIL should purely be influenced by the viability of the local area and development coming forwards.
But if a developer says it's not viable for a site to be adopted, which they're doing, and we're seeing more and more management orders, is it something that we could look at? Because they're saying it's not viable, and this site isn't. So we have a problem as a borough in relation to non-adoption of open space and roads, and it's becoming more of a problem. Is it not something within the guidelines that we could use and explore?
Yeah.
Perhaps I can answer that one, because I understand the concerns which members have got about adoption and the preference that in many cases that the open space is adopted by the Borough Council. I think that the challenge we've got, and I know you've heard this regularly from Mike Townsend at the Control Committee, is that through the planning process we can ensure that there's a mechanism that the open space is adopted or is managed in perpetuity. But what we can't do through the Section 106 process is identify a preferred manager, i.e. the Borough Council. I understand the concern, and I think by and large officers recognise and actually agree with you on that point, but unfortunately the constraints of planning legislation and the way that Section 106s can be are prepared doesn't allow that to happen. I'm conscious there's an ongoing debate about this issue, but I think, as I say, I think there's a constraint within planning legislation which doesn't allow that particular aspiration to be achieved.
Can I come up? We talked about it a little bit in the briefing that we had before the meeting. What's the sort of flexibility with the SIL rates we have in front of us? If we feel they need to be changed at a later date, if we approve them tonight, what's the sort of flexibility and how does that system?
We envisaged that we would want to keep SIL rates under review, potentially looking at them again every 3 to 5 years, unless something significant happens in the market and we see values increasing or decreasing significantly, in which case that could be a trigger to undertake a review. If we wish to review the SIL rates, we need to go through the process of consultation and examination again, so it's quite a lengthy process.
That's Rafael. Councillor Raffel.
Thank you. I'm just trying to answer the question best I can. Of course, the end of the consultation, there could maybe a need to adjust the rates to a slight degree as a result of what's been said prior to submission. And within the bounds of how significant is that will depend on whether we need to bring it all back to committee or go for wider consultation again, or whether in fact actually it can go straight to examination with the slight adjustments. Thereafter, of course, we have examination where to some degree things could be either agreed as they are or could be slightly changed as a result of the examination, or of course could be sent back for further work. So there are those stages built into this process, but the assumption, hopefully, is that the existing rates that are being set based upon the methodology will get through to adoption, and thereafter, of course, we will keep them under review, and if we find there are some very awkward anomalies that are emerging quite quickly, then it's of course open to us to try and address them and put them back to for examination to change the rates. But it's like all of these things, my plea to you is that we get a rate set so that we can actually find out if there are anomalies, having tried our best to iron them out in advance, rather than pause for some perfection where we don't actually know whether it is perfect because we haven't actually jumped into the situation to find out.
Councillor Rattigan.
I support what you're saying, Councillor Raffel, about adopting these rates. I have no problems with that, but there isn't the golf course sticks out as a complete anomaly to me, and I don't feel that a rate that's £60 below the rest of Basingstoke is the right figure. I take on board that the land value is slightly higher than agriculture. I get all of that, but it seems to me like a large anomaly. On a big site, we will receive less money in this council, and we will have less money to do what we want for our borough and for the people who live here. And I support the majority of this. This is a good piece of work, but that looks like an anomaly to me. And I don't know when. I don't want to wait 3 years or 5 years when it's actually happening to make a change on it. I'd rather make the change at the beginning rather than at the end.
Yeah, Dominic.
If it helps, really, the part of what the golf course will be providing for through Section 106, which is in addition to the type of infrastructure that would be provided for on other sites, say of 100 dwellings. So the golf course is providing infrastructure to the tune of about £11,600 per dwelling. Yeah, and so about £12 million worth of infrastructure. Now that goes part of the way towards closing that gap that you've identified. I mean, I haven't done the arithmetic in the way to see if it absolutely closes it, but you can see that it will go part of the way there.
Councillor Parker.
Well, I must make sure I'm understanding the previous comments, because I noticed on there we've got Hanson Fields is 18,633, and that they were paying for the roundabout. So again, how does that equate with the golf course, who are paying only 11,633?
Well, because Hanson Fields is paying more in terms of the infrastructure than the golf course, it's proposed to have a lower sill rate. So the sill rate for Hanson Fields is £30 per square metre, compared to the sill rate for the golf course, which is £80 per square metre. So that's how the two fit together. In a way, if I put the sill rates up on that slide as well, then you can compare. There is a clue, I suppose, in that if you see basically the length of blue bar above the yellow line, that's the amount that's available for sill, and the sill rates reflect that. They don't mirror it exactly, but they are. But they're informed by it. So the more viable the site, the higher the sill rate. So you can see that Upper Coolford Farm and Golf Course and East of Basingstoke are the three most viable strategic sites, and you can see it from that graph, and they're the ones that are being proposed to have an £80 a square metre rate, compared to Hounsome Fields, the least viable, £30 a square metre, and Maydown sort of sits in the middle with £60 per square metre.
Councillor Harvey.
It's a different issue. So you want me to wait and raise something
Were
different?
you on this one? Councillor Raskin. Thank you, Councillor.
Your bar charts show that the golf club is the most viable site, and there's a differential between East Basingstoke and the farm site. Now, why hasn't there a differential been made, even if it was £100 on that golf club site, rather than lumping the three sites together?
The two sort of simple reasons, I suppose, really come back to the higher land value for the golf course. So part of the decision about whether to set its own rate or to put it together is partly the higher land value, and it's also within the context of the guidance saying keep your charging schedule simple. So the two factors, in very basic terms, are why, in my judgment, it makes sense to group those three together. But I would fully and freely admit it's a judgment, and it isn't an arithmetic calculation.
Chair, that comes back to my point earlier. Simplicity does not provide this council with the money that it requires to do what it needs to do for those residents. So now, you've already done the piece of work. There must be a way of working that out, that £80, if we had £100 on that site, and we're delivering more money for our residents, surely that is the job of this committee, is to pull out the best SIL money for our residents.
Dominic.
I think as I understand it, the judgment and the responsibility that the council have, that the councillors have, is to balance the need to fund infrastructure with the need not to jeopardise development. That's the judgment. Well, I've made my recommendation based on my judgments, taking factors into account. As I said, particularly for the golf course, the higher land value and the infrastructure that it's providing, and keeping a reasonably simple charging schedule, I think are good reasons to not excessively charge any of the strategic sites, not just the golf course. I think my sort of council would be caution in terms of the SIL rates on strategic sites.
On the same point, Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just on this point, what actually... So,
and it seems that forgetting the turn of phrase, the three have been calculated individually, and in each given £80 individually, but are put in the same bracket, just for the way the scale has been calculated here, because they're all on the £80 calculation. So they're not lumped in, if that's what was meant. But Ms. Tewson was just saying, Dominic was just saying a bit more about it. Did you?
Well, yes, they are. I mean, they're individually calculated. The judgment relates to of the theoretical maximum that each site could, on paper, provide as of our viability assessment. The judgment is what proportion of that theoretical maximum, and how will the inevitable differences be expressed within the charging schedule. Does one round it and group them for simplicity's sake, as the guidance suggests, or do you say, actually, no, we're going to go for a more complex charging schedule?
The golf club itself, the members, they want to sell. Therefore, the land value is actually less, because they want to make that sale. They aren't looking out for the best price. They are looking to make the sale. And that is obvious among the 800 members there, that they want to take their capital for their membership and buy another golf club or move off somewhere else. But the fact that they want to do that, it actually lowers the value the land because they are willing sellers.
Well, I mean, I think for all of the strategic sites, the work is done on the principle that all of the landowners are willing sellers. I recognise that you're referring to the phrase about a willing developer and a willing seller within the NPPF. Yes, for any of the strategic sites to be part of the local plan, the assumption is that they're all willing sellers and they're all, one way or another, putting forward their sites for development. I don't think we can usefully go down the path of determining what the correct price for the golf course would be, if I may offer that thought, really. I mean, we've set a benchmark beneath which we say we don't think a willing landowner would sell, but once you start getting into a specific negotiation, I think that's beyond what I can deal with here today.
Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to come back because I realise that we're not experts and it's a judgment thing. What level you can go to with your SIL without deterring developers and so on. So we're obviously pretty reliant on your experience on this. Can I just ask you, what is your experience vis-à-vis the examiner? I mean, what part does the examiner play in this? Has he ever come back and said, look, this is too complicated, or you should reduce the number of different rates, or anything like that?
Examiners will direct councils to alter their charging schedule, generally by reducing rates rather than increasing them. I'm not aware of an examiner increasing rates. Examiners will, as part of that, I think, do some simplification, but I think only where there's evidence to require it. I think the examiner is particularly looking for whether the balance has been struck between providing infrastructure and not jeopardising development with SIL rates. I think that is likely to be the key question, really.
Councillor Harvey.
Thanks, Chair. Moving on from residential to commercial, I wanted to pick up the point in one of the tables, looking at the SIL rates and the changes to large supermarkets or small supermarkets, but actually retail shops outside Basingstoke town centre and retail warehouses now at 40, whereas before it was 150. I guess the question is again about simplicity. The values in the Association of Basingview is one thing, Danehill is something else, Jay's Close is something else again, and so on. And I think in the context of warehouse using to retail, to leisure, to town centre, to and so on, those values are inherently different, and any analysis of the commercial sector would give you that. I understand that. So a single one-size-fits-all in that example isn't doing this council, I think, justice, or for that matter, encouraging, if I know we're not allowed to use it as a tool, but nonetheless it would do, because of how you set it, principally, using the legislation, will still nonetheless shape the economic development that comes forward. I just think we should look at that in a bit more detail. I know you want to get this on the books, I get that, but this is a once only in terms of the commercial side as much as residential. I'd like to see that unpacked a bit more, and I do think there are differences in the values that are worth exploring.
I think it's fair to say that at the developer workshop we had a particularly detailed discussion about retail values, primarily around the different retail values within the centre of Basingstoke, and we discussed at some length the different zones, and actually in a very kind of helpful and constructive way. And although through that process town centre retail was not able to pay SIL, we also did touch on the values for out-of-town retail. The out-of-town retail that is primarily modelled within the work I've done here has been on retail parks, sort of edge-of-centre retail parks, and they are able to meet a reasonable land value and therefore able to pay a SIL. The values haven't changed that much since we last did the work, but the build costs have increased very substantially. Now, on that basis, what that's meant is that they're not able to pay enough SIL. So in a straightforward way within the parameters of that calculation, that's where we've got to with that. Yeah, I mean, we did. Yes, that's true. Yes, Mark's reminds me of sensitivity testing. On page 106 of your report, so page 68 of mine, you'll see that for the non-residential, we did sensitivity tests where we sort of modelled increases in values and also increases in costs. So, I mean, what happens really is that as the values increase, yes, nominally, both of the non-residential uses that are able to pay a SIL should be able to pay a bit more, but it actually needs some very, very significant increases before other retail uses are able to come into the SIL net. The other thing that I would also draw your attention to, and this is only a very minor reason compared to the actual calculations, but it's worthwhile bearing in mind nonetheless, is that there will be many thousands of houses delivered through the course of this plan, but there will be very few retail warehouses. I would have said, okay, in floor space terms, they may be quite substantial, but there aren't going to be that many of them. So whilst it's still important to get it right, I just say that actually just a sense of proportionality as well. So it's a minor reason compared to the calculations. So I do believe the calculations are right, but it's also useful to consider how it would fit, even if you double the rate. What kind of difference would that make really to the amount of infrastructure funding that the council would get? Okay, if you got an IKEA, then it would make a difference, but beyond that, yes, it would make a marginal difference. Would be my argument.
I mean, outside of the town centre is what we're talking about. I appreciate that, and that's my focus in terms of this question. If we have the economic ambition that we've got, and if we're talking, and we always concentrate on the residential, I get that, and we've done that consistently in the local plan. From an economic point of view, I still think that's a fairly large missing piece of the puzzle on this, and we need to give a lot more thought, I think, to that. You know, you're right about the IKEA. It's not the only show in town. You know, there are other major aspects to our economic strategy that would fit with desiring Basingview, Jewel, all of them to have different aspects that would then change the calculation on this. I still feel, whichever way you look at it, a one-size-fits-all. It's a bit like all the other arguments we've had tonight. It just does need to be more sophisticated. But I understand what you're saying, and I hear it. And yes, they should shoulder it if they can, and those values will differ, and some of them will be able to pay more SIL and should pay more SIL, and we shouldn't be excusing that because of the overall average that we see across the whole of our economic sector. Just putting it all in one isn't the same as actually differentiating what we do have as a local economy.
I mean, just to say, in essence, I would agree. The out-of-town retail the value of it will in part depend on the covenant of the operator, the strength of the brand. So, I mean, I'm sure you can all picture the sorts of brands that are likely to occupy out-of-town retail. Some of them will be M&S Simply Food, with probably a very high covenant. I beg your pardon, that's maybe not a good example, because of course that's convenience. But there will be other retailers like Boots and Next, which are commonly seen in out-of-town retail parks, but there will also be the Wickses of the world as well, who, while still able to pay quite a reasonable value, are not going to be paying the same sorts of values as the Boots and Next and so on. On the other hand, the 99p stores bizarrely are likely to do very well because they are able to pay a lot. So there will be variations, and the judgment here is to actually look at what is quite disparate evidence in comparison to the evidence you see in terms of house sales. So house sales, although they will vary, it's much easier to see the patterns, not least because there's many more examples. When one's considering the evidence for retail rents, they're actually much less homogenous. And we've tried to steer a reasonable course through that, where we haven't just picked the highest achievable rents, because it's quite clear that that won't always be the case.
Thank you, members. I think I'd like to draw us to a close in terms of questions, move towards debate, and if we could have a look at the three recommendations. put those up in front of us just to focus in mind. We have 3 recommendations before us tonight. First of which is to note the findings of the residential and non-residential SIL viability report. Second is to provide comments to the portfolio holder who's been here diligently taking notes prior to Cabinet meeting next week, and of course Council. And then 3, to endorse the proposal for public consultation. If I may, to my mind, I think we've had agreed comments around concerns around the simplicity of the boundaries that are used, and some of the simplicities in the model in terms of the rating and how they're grouped together. There was concern raised about the £0 SIL for completely flatted properties. Concerns around the SIL that is applied to many down, and I think that was the 3 I had that were broadly agreed. Does anyone else have agreed?
Chair, can I ask you to look at the urban areas within the countryside, like so Overton, Whitchurch, Kingsclere, in that, just to look at, see if there would be if there can be a differential in that.
Forgive me if I wasn't clear. In terms of the simplicity of the boundaries, that was exactly my point. That, you know, we have some feelings about just doing it as a Basingstoke and Tadley or non-Basingstoke. So I hope I've captured those. Is there anything else you need from me on that? Okay.
Payment in kind.
Payment in kind. I'm perfectly happy to highlight that as a comment of the committee. The other thing I was going to say, just aside from these 3 points then, is I think we've also agreed that we will have a piece coming back to us as a committee regarding how we look at SIL moving forward beyond this stage, how we prioritise it, how we spend it, what's on the 1, 2, 3 list, how we deal with the 15% and 25% as well. Councillor Parker.
And just add to that then, please, ward councillor and community engagement.
And ward councillor and community engagement. Are we happy to move on and approval of the recommendations and those comments? Okay, thank you very much, committee members. Councillor Parker.
I know you said your thanks to the visitor, but can I just make one point in regard to this paper that we've discussed tonight? I'd like to say a personal thank you for the briefing note that we received on introduction, having read through several of the prior papers over the last three years, I think. I thought that was a very good piece of work. It's very succinct.
I'd like to echo those, both
Alison, I think it was.
Yeah. To Alison and to Dominic, thank you for coming down tonight. I think it's been very helpful for us as a committee to be briefed on some of those issues before we got to it, so that we could be as productive as possible in this meeting. You can. Thanks from Councillor Raphael. Agenda item 8, review of the work programme. To my mind, we've had 4 items that will need timetabling after today's meeting. If I could outline those, that's the point raised by Councillor Harvey regarding supporting people, and then that needs to come back to committee for review. There's the East of Basingstoke design brief, and some concerns around the timetabling around that. There is an item around SIL and how we spend it, and a piece on affordable housing delivery that Councillor James raised that I think would be helpful for us to look at as a committee. Is that broadly in line with what we've agreed, or have I missed something or added something? Section 106 was part of that affordable housing, so is that possible to do as a
do it as one piece?
a joint piece? Coming to the next meeting. What I was going to suggest, if committee members will indulge, Councillor James.
I was just also wondering, historically we had the bid come to this committee. It would be quite good that the manager of the bid comes back to give us an update on where they are and what they're up to.
I'm broadly in agreement, but I think it'd be great to see what the bid. Now, if I remember correctly, the new manager started in March, so I think we'll give her a bit of time to bed in, but perhaps by the autumn or early new year, that would seem sensible to me too. What I was going to say, with your indulgence, members, what I'd like to do is speak to officers about the timetabling of this to see when they can bring it forward and to work that. And if we could, bearing in mind we have a meeting next week, if we could look at a bit more detail then, so that we've got a realistic view of when these things, because I'm wary of putting them in and then having to change it at a later date, having experienced that already in the last 2 months of my chairmanship. So if that's all right with you, I'd like to do the exact timetabling at the next meeting. Other than that, thank you all very much for a productive meeting. Thank you to our guests, thank you to the officers, and good night. Meetings will close. 9 o'clock.